Hi everyone. This is going to be our final video on the Scotch Gambit as seen from Black's point of view. So here the move bishop c4 is the Scotch Gambit, and knight to f6 is our move, and the main line continues e5, but we're going to look at some alternatives for white in this position. So one alternative is knight to g5, attacking the f7 square, just like in the two knights defense. So we'll block the attack with d5, and then after e takes d5, we'll throw in this check, queen to e7. And there's no satisfactory way to block the check. If white blocks with the bishop, then we can get this pawn back on d5, and if white blocks with the queen, we can trade queens first, and then get that pawn back. So it turns out the best move for white in the position is king to f1. And after king to f1, we can save our c6 knight and attack his bishop. He might defend the bishop by regaining the pawn on d4. Well, go ahead and trade minor pieces here, and then drive his knight back. And then since your bishop is stuck on the f8 square, I would recommend queen to c5 in that position. And Black's doing well. He's down a pawn, but he has the bishop pair. He's better developed, and white's king is displaced. So I prefer the black side in this position. Okay, let's look at another alternative here. So instead of knight to g5, we'll consider knight takes d4. So if you see knight takes d4, you can take the pawn on e4. It looks a little dangerous to do that, opening the e file while your king is still sitting there. But he's not castled yet, and we do have the move d5 to help anchor that knight. So it's not very dangerous unless white tries bishop takes f7 check. That's the one move we really should be prepared for, sacrificing a piece. And here's the point. We'll go ahead and take the bishop, and then queen to h5 check, g6 blocks, and queen to d5 check will regain the piece. But black's perfectly safe. We just tuck our king on the g7 square, and white can take the knight off on c6 first and break up our pawn structure, and then take the piece back on e4. So material's equal, but black is actually kind of safe here. In fact, if you want to get even safer, you can remove the white queen from the board with this nice tactical move, queen to e8. So this forces an exchange of queens, and if white takes, we have bishop to b4 check, unleashing an attack on the white queen here. Okay, so maybe knight c3, and then we take the queen with check, bishop e3, and black's doing well. He has the bishop pair, he's better developed, he has pressure down the e file. He can mess up white's pawn structure by taking on c3 if he wants. So I prefer black in that position. Okay, and let's go back to the fifth move again. So right here after knight f6, probably the most common alternative to the main line is castles. And if you see castles, I do recommend taking the pawn on e4, even though he can get in the move rook to e1 here. There's an alternative to rook to e1, which we'll look at in a minute, but let's start with rook to e1. Okay, we save our knight with d5, and the knight's fine right there for now, and our plan is to play bishop to e7 or bishop to e6 and castle. And so white needs to do something about that, and the only way white can justify this line of play is to take the pawn on d5 and sacrifice the bishop. So the point is, white's removing the defender of the knight, and we will take the bishop, and then there is this move knight to c3. The pawn is pinned. We can't lose our queen here, and white's forking the queen and the knight, so white's winning the piece back. So we have to move the queen, and I recommend putting it on a5, and then knight takes e4, and white's threatening some discovered checks down the e file, And there's different ways to play here, but I recommend bishop to e6. Just block that e file and get ready to castle on the queen side. And if white plays knight eg5 to attack the bishop, then we're going to go ahead and give a pawn back. We're just going to castle, and then white can take on e6 twice and get their pawn back. Here I would recommend developing this dark squared bishop to e7, because that counteracts white's bishop from coming to g5, and also we can play that bishop to f6 and support our central pawn. So right here the engine assesses this as just about equal, and I do like black's position, so it's okay. So nothing to fear in that line. But going back to the position here, instead of rook to e1, after we took that pawn on e4, white can try an interesting gambit, knight to c3. And this can lead to really wild play. I do not recommend taking the knight with the d-pawn. It's just too dangerous. You can study this if you want to. The engine actually says that's the best move. But here's what could happen. Bishop takes f7 check, sacrificing a second piece. Okay, we take the bishop, and then the queen comes to d5 with check, and white's going to regain a piece here. So king to e8, and white can actually play rook to e1, pinning the piece and adding another attacker. And there's just too much pressure on black's position. Apparently black can hold here. The score is negative 0.3. I'm looking at it on the engine now. But approximately an even score shows just how much compensation white has for the sacrificed material. And I don't want to play this position with my king stuck in the center of the board. So going back, if I do see this move knight c3, this sacrifice, what I would do is take it with the knight, not the pawn. Okay, and that way I won't have any trouble on the e file. Okay, after that, white can take back, and then we can play d5 and threaten the bishop. Bishop to b5, and now we want to get castled as quickly as possible and get our king off the e file. So bishop e7, knight takes d4, and now there's pressure on c6, so we will take time to play bishop to d7. And we're ready to castle on the king side, and again we're doing just fine. Black is up a pawn, and he's safe. White does have some compensation, but white's pawn structure is also compromised on the queen side. So I slightly prefer black in the position, and so does the engine. So that's nothing to worry about. Okay, so those were the major alternatives for white on the fifth move, and I hope now you're prepared for them. Thanks for watching the video series.